Thank you, Andrew, and I want to say what a pleasure and honor it is to be back here with you, some old friends and some new ones, and wonderful to be taking part. Let me tell you what I thought I would try and do, and there isn't time to read the whole paper to you. I do want to get some feedback from you. I've already gotten some very valuable feedback from Professor Hutchison, and let me encourage you. Send me an email. I'll send you the written draft of this paper. I'll revise it in keeping with what I learned from your feedback, both today and in your emails. What I wanted to do was to figure out how we could learn from the idea that human beings are created in the image of God. That is to say, what can we learn about God from what we know about humans? What can we learn about ourselves from what we know about God's action in the world, which is where we see the effects of God? And I had, in the body of the paper, I referred to several different texts. The first of them is a text from Galen, which doesn't survive in Greek, but does survive in Arabic. Fascinating criticism of Moses, as he puts it, from Galen. The criticism is this. Galen says, Galen likes to be very observant. One of the things I learned on reading about Galen is that the word autopsy was a favorite of Galen's, and what he meant by it, as those of you who know Greek very well know very well, seeing for yourself. That's what autopsy means. And he thought that there was no substitute for seeing for yourself. One of the things that he did in priding himself on his understanding of anatomy was to point out the remarkable fact. It takes a scientist of sensitivity to notice how remarkable the fact is that our eyelashes and our eyebrows don't grow at any length as our hair does and get into our eyes. He thought that this was a good mark of divine providence. And he takes the mechanistic, deterministic philosophers of his time, whether they were Epicureans or followers of one of his arch medical rivals. He takes them to task for trying to explain everything mechanistically. They don't see how this regulation of hair length really serves in our interests and is a marker in the world of divine action in the world. Special action, divine, general action, he doesn't specify. He knows it always works the same way, pretty much. And since philosophers, and Galen, as you know, wrote a book called The Best Physician is a Philosopher, he thought, as a philosopher, he liked to do what philosophers always do, which is situate himself in the middle between two extremes. And so he situates himself between the mechanistic physicians and philosophers like the Epicureans on the one side, and Moses, as he puts it, on the other side. Moses, he says, apparently believed that God just had to tell the hair how to behave and issue his command, and he says, sarcastically really, apparently the hair of your eyelashes and your eyebrows was in awe of the divine command or frightened by it and consequently obeyed. And he says that's not correct either. And the way he tries to situate himself in between the mechanistic extreme of the atomists and the Mosaic extreme, as he pictures it, of the people who think that God is just commanding things to happen and without any explanation they do happen, is to say that you can't neglect the purposes of things and the mechanics of things. These two have to work together. That is his way of wanting to put himself there. He's looking for what the mechanists leave out, and what they leave out is the idea of purpose, the idea of some good being served by the things that are designed into the operations of the world. He doesn't think that this happened just by chance. He doesn't think that mechanics can explain it. And what mechanics has left out, and the followers of Moses have been wise enough to take account of, is the fact that there are goods in the world. And Galen, being a good follower not only of Stoic philosophy but of Plato, believed that relative goods presuppose and point towards an absolute good. That if one thing is better than another, if it's better that your hair not get in your eyes, then there must be some absolute good which is responsible for the occurrence of that. That's what the mechanists left out. He wants to find an understanding of how that happened, and of course, he was as much in the dark about how that happened as Moses and the original readers of Scripture actually were. He had no idea of genes or of regulation of development and so forth, such as we have today. We're beginning to get an inkling of how those processes are regulated. But the important thing, and the point at which Galen was in sympathy with Moses, as he puts it, from his second century awareness of what Scripture has to say on the subject, the thing that can't be left out and shouldn't be left out, and that mechanism cannot explain by itself, is how and why goods are pursued. In the body of the paper, I talk about the fact that Darwinism, for example, has not eliminated our awareness of the fact that goods are preserved. One of Darwin's sons actually said that one of the great achievements of Charles Darwin's work was to restore teleology to its proper respect in biology. The fact that purposes are served in nature is part of what Darwin wanted to explain, and he would have eliminated the explanandum if he had done away with what he thought natural selection can explain. The idea that that goods are served represents the first of the three dimensions in which I wanted to connect our understanding of God with our understanding of ourselves, if we have such an understanding of ourselves. The dimension I'm thinking of is what we would normally call wisdom. And we'd want to understand, there are some philosophers like Daniel Dennett, for example, who are not uncomfortable with using the word design. They think that they can use the word design without reference to a designer. What wisdom has that mechanism lacks is an idea of purpose, the idea that something is being attained. The fact that there are goods in the world, that there are interests that could be very local interests, the interests of an organism, the interest of the organism not only in maintaining its own survival, but in propagating, and the interest of a lineage in evolving. One of the things that we have learned about since those ancient thinkers. The fact that there are interests in the world at all is a mark of divine wisdom as expressed in the world. And if you ask yourself, what distinguishes wisdom from calculation? I think what distinguishes wisdom from merely going through some logical process is that there's value involved. That's where the notion of purpose comes in, where something is being attained, something is being achieved. I have two more dimensions of connection, if you will, or analogy, structural relationship between humanity and the divine. Wisdom was the first. My second is freedom, and my third is creativity. In regard to freedom, take a look at the well-known GRU problem, the notion that if you're going to be a good and very disciplined empiricist, you don't necessarily know the difference from a very crude kind of empiricism between something that's the color green and something that's the color GRU. The color GRU, those philosophers in the room know, is a color which looks green until a date certain, at which point it suddenly and inexplicably turns blue. I say that that problem is a problem, let's say it's a problem which is symptomatic of a certain rather crude form of empiricism, and maybe it helps us understand what's crude about that form of empiricism. Anybody who was a scientist or an engineer or somebody who was actually working with colors in a paint factory would want to know, if we have a color that's unstable in that way, we want to know why that is. We'd be looking for the mechanism that made that happen. One of the things that one does in science is to make certain assumptions about the dispositions of things, about their causal impact, and about the capabilities that things have for maintaining stability, maintaining some kind of continuity, giving us some kind of coherent experience of the world. That's what we're looking for in science, and that's what we're looking for in ordinary life. The idea of freedom comes into play, in my view, not because of unpredictability and not because of arbitrariness, but because of, not because of uncaused actions, but because of self-caused actions. I guess I'm one of those agent determinists. That is, as Kant put it, freedom involves not the denial of causation, but the introduction of a special case of causation, the kind where the agent himself or herself is responsible for an outcome. And of course, our freedom is limited, just as our wisdom is limited, but it's an area, I would suggest, where we have a connection with divine freedom. And human freedom, if we know it from our own agency, tells us something about how God works in the world. We see that, in my view, in the instance of emergence. Emergence is a kind of developmental change where the outcome of the change is not reducible to its predecessors. We see an ampliative kind of motion. We see growth. We see change. I think evolution is the most familiar case of emergence, but we see it also, for example, in the main sequence of the life of stars and galaxies, where you start out with, well, if you really want to start out with the Big Bang, you start out with something very, very small, which enlarges and develops. But think about the cooking of elements in the stars, where you have hydrogen fusing into helium, and then you have 6 atoms of carbon coming together 2 by 2 to form carbon, and you get metals being formed. You can see with the spectroscope elements going up very high into the natural elements being formed in the stars. That's another form of emergence, and the key in defining emergence, which is, I think, one of the key areas where divine action takes place, the key in understanding emergence is that the properties of that product, the properties of what has come to be, are not describable, are not explainable. It's not just that they're not predictable. They don't speak the same language at all as the constituents that made that possible, that gave that history its beginning. You can see an analogy, I think, in mathematics. I don't think that you can derive geometry from arithmetic. There's more to geometry than arithmetic, and unless you start introducing some new notions, like the notion of a line and a plane and the notion of space, I don't think you're going to get to geometry. The remarkable thing about nature, and where I think you can see divine freedom at work, is in that growth of life out of what wasn't alive, and of thought out of what wasn't so capable of consciousness. I put this under the category of freedom because I think it's pretty well established now that there are alternative futures which were never realized. That a better and more intuitive way of putting it is that the future is open. It's the openness of the future, I think, that gives us our human freedom, the fact that there is contingency in the world, the fact that things don't have to be turning out the way they do, the fact that there's no necessity of logic, that it's not self-contradictory to say that things might have turned out other than they did. Those are markers of the open future. That's a marvelous situation to be in. It's a situation in which we get our freedom, but there's a little bit more to it than just the possibility of the future being radically and qualitatively different from the past, and that is the fact that time has a kind of direction to it which is given to it by the fact of emergence. What I mean by that is not just that time flows in one direction, not just that the future is not the same as the past. That might be enough only to give you a notion of fate or weirdness or something like that. The openness of the future also involves the possibility of the rise of autonomy. If you look at evolution, you'll find that evolution has a direction. Evolution, to borrow a phrase from Teilhard de Chardin, evolution seems to be groping and trying all different kinds of things and putting chance in its own service to make those possibilities experimental possibilities. The rise of autonomy is the thread of Theseus. We refer to Theseus once again, but this time not making arbitrary choices, but following a thread. And Teilhard de Chardin describes that thread as, he describes it in terms of the rise of consciousness. He points out, for example, that insects with their exoskeletons are so heavy that they never get big enough to have a brain like ours. Therefore, all the complexities of their behavior, if they're going to get very complex at all, have to be on the social level. That's why you have very complex behavior in bees and ants and termites. But their exoskeletons have prevented them from developing that complexity, which allows for reflexivity, which allows for the rise of individuality and consciousness and caring, which is capable in a different experiment, which is ours, of course. The rise of autonomy in nature is a mark of divine freedom, and it's what distinguishes divine freedom as a matter of grace rather than mere fate. a big and important distinction for all of us. I refer in the body of the paper, again, I'm happy to send it to you. I refer to the work of Lawrence Henderson on the fitness of the environment. Henderson was very careful to eschew notions of teleology, elan vital, no such thing. But what he was noticing was that the world seems to involve a kind of welcomeness for the possibility of life, and not just of life, but of consciousness. That I think is very important. You don't have hooks without eyes in the world that we live in. And that's actually a fact of nature because of the character of living beings. Living beings can't exist in isolation. They all depend on each other. Aristotle knew that. There are ecosystems, and there are feedback systems, and there are systems that are to some degree self-stabilizing, whether in the planets or in living beings. And that interdependence of things, which the Stoics tended to anthropomorphize as sympatheia, they called it, the interconnectedness of all things, is in a way providential. Nothing would be useful to us unless it had purposes of its own. And all these things with their purposes of their own turn out to be useful to one another. My third point is about creativity. I'll mention a couple of highlights here, one from a medieval thinker and one from a contemporary of ours. The medieval thinker is Ibn Ezra. Ibn Ezra, a great exegete. I'm embarrassed to be called a scriptural scholar next to Ibn Ezra, a great exegete of the Middle Ages. One of the things he says in glossing the opening sentence of the book of Genesis is that the Hebrew word bara, which means, that's the one we usually translate as created. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. The Hebrew word bara suggests scission. It suggests cutting off. It suggests separation. He's looking at the etymology of the word. And what I get from that comment of his is the freedom, the wisdom, the grace that's involved in the act of creation. God doesn't give us just existence, but gives us the powers to exist. God doesn't just give us interests and needs, but gives us the environment in which those needs can be accomplished and fulfilled. The contemporary thinker I'm going to mention is Stephen Barr, a physicist who is very theistic, and he has looked at 10 different ways in which the universe is welcoming to life. He starts out with very basic things about the nature of electrical charges and atomic forces and intra-atomic forces, and he points out that were it not for certain parameters that can be observed in the basic construction of matter, electrons would have collapsed. Hydrogen atoms would have been impossible on certain other conditions. Helium atoms would have been impossible. Nothing would have gotten beyond your basic helium. You wouldn't have much chemistry with that because hydrogen isn't going to give you a good basis for life, and helium is chemically inert. He goes on, he has a wonderful list. You can see them in his book, Ancient Faith and Modern Physics, and I've summarized them in the written version of my paper. He ends with two wonderful ones, which I'll mention in closing. The fact that we live in a quantum universe, which, as he points out, is not only not a logical necessity, but in fact, very counterintuitive in many ways, and probably not yet figured out exactly how to reconcile our intuitions with it. But if we didn't live in a quantum universe, we wouldn't have discrete chemical properties of things. There wouldn't be valences. There wouldn't be much that we know familiarly. And then he mentions one, and since everyone knows about Paley and his watch and his watchmaker, score one for Paley here. Paley noticed that we live in a universe of 3 dimensions. If we lived in a universe with fewer dimensions, we wouldn't live at all. If we lived in a universe with more dimensions than 3, laws like the inverse square law of gravity and electromagnetic force would not hold, and we'd live in a very funny place at all if we could live in such a world at all. It's a very remarkable thing. There's no logical necessity that there be just 3 dimensions, but lo and behold, there are, and we should be very happy and thankful that that's the way it is. Thank you.